vaccinations about to begin in the brigade tomorrow, a hopeful and important milestone in a difficult year in our history. So perhaps tonight is a good time for reflecting some about history. I'm Tom McCarthy, Chair of the History Department at the United States Naval Academy, and welcome to the 41st Annual George Bancroft Memorial Lecture. Each year, the History Department celebrates the 1845 founding of the Naval Academy by Secretary of the Navy George Bancroft by inviting a distinguished historian to share her or his work with our Naval Academy community. We do so because George Bancroft was best known to Americans of his time as a historian. In 1834, he published the first volume of what became the 19th century's most popular history of the United States. Bancroft wrote history when it was still a popular branch of literature, but he was also one of the first historians to earn a doctorate, and he was a proponent of archival research and the careful handling of evidence, all harbingers of the development of academic history and contributions recognized in his election as the second president of the American Historical Association in 1885. In addition to being Secretary of the Navy, Bancroft served as our ambassador to the United Kingdom and later to Germany. He reminds us, as do leaders like Winston Churchill and John F. Kennedy, that there is no better preparation for leadership and public service than to be a lifelong student and writer of history. I would be remiss tonight if I did not pause to recognize Larry Thompson. Larry established this lecture when he was our department chair in 1980. He passed away on Sunday, but his legacy lives on in this lecture and in his many other contributions to the Naval Academy and our students. Tonight, we're delighted to have with us one of the great historians in this generation, Dr. Vincent Brown. Dr. Brown is the Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, where he is also the founding director of the History Design Studio, which is pioneering new modes of historical storytelling in multiple media. His research, writing, teaching, and creative endeavors are focused on the political dimensions of cultural practice in the African diaspora, with a particular emphasis on the early modern Atlantic world. He is the author of numerous articles and reviews in scholarly journals, and he was the principal investigator and curator for the animated thematic map, Slave Revolt in Jamaica, a Cartographic Narrative. He was the producer and director of research for the award-winning television documentary, Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness, broadcast nationally on the PBS series Independent Lens. He is the author of two multiple prize-winning books, The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, and most recently, Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war, published last year by Belknap Press. The title of Dr. Brown's talk tonight is Charting the Course of an Atlantic Slave War. A quick administrative note before we begin, Dr. Brown will field questions at the end of his talk. We'd like to ask you, if you have a question, to send them to the email address for Dr. Sagstetter that you'll see at the beginning of Dr. Brown's talk, and then again at the end. You don't have to wait until the end of his talk to send in a question. If a question occurs to you during the talk, just go ahead and fire away. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Vincent Brown.
Well, thank you, Professor McCarthy, for that very generous introduction. And I also want to thank Professor Sagstetter for inviting me to give this lecture to you all this evening. It's a great pleasure and honor. And thank you for joining me. It's great to have an opportunity to speak with you. I'm sorry I couldn't be in Annapolis with you, but as we've all learned over the course of the past year, world historic plagues are inconvenient. So I wish you Godspeed in getting your vaccinations. I guess it's starting tomorrow, and putting this behind us, as I know we will soon. I'm faithful that we will. So as I understand it, the mission of the U.S. Naval Academy is to encourage your mental, moral, and physical development. I know because I looked it up. I hope to make a small contribution to that mission tonight by introducing you to the big history of a small war. One that compels us to think and rethink about some of our fundamental assumptions of what we consider to be our history and why we should care about it. And even if you don't find my arguments compelling, maybe I can still contribute to your physical development by keeping you in a chair staring at the screen for an hour, preparing you for the long hours of boredom that your duties and responsibilities will often require of you. So get ready. Let me share my screen here and give you a sense of the material that I want to show you. All right. So you probably don't know that in 1776, Great Britain's most important American colony was on the verge of insurrection. Colonists perceived that the government in Britain was conspiring against the rights of imperial subjects. They feared a plot against the English liberties that they had long enjoyed. At their dinner tables, they heatedly discussed the merits of open sedition. Those disaffected with imperial governance dwelled upon the topic of American rebellion. As these Jamaican colonists debated liberty, their slaves saw an opportunity. The island was at a critical juncture, with the British entry into yet another imperial war. Colonists traded exaggerated accounts of a French and Spanish military buildup in the Caribbean and calculated that there were 30 slaves to every white person ready to join the attempts of any enemy in a general massacre, they said. Now, that's all in this letter here. I don't expect you to be able to read that, but I want to give you a sense of how historians know this. On July 3rd, a regiment of troops left Hanover Parish for a rendezvous at Port Royal, scheduled to depart the island for North America by the end of the month. Throughout that parish, enslaved people gathered frequently in houses, grounds, and open fields to hold very serious conversations, which stopped suddenly upon the approach of anyone they did not trust. They were strategizing. Now or never, they thought, was the time to make themselves masters of the country. The moment seemed right for a successful uprising, but this American Revolution was not to be. As so often happened with slave rebellions, the plot was betrayed and the conspiracy unraveled. When the British in Jamaica considered the gravity of their predicament in 1776, rather than looking ahead to the loss of the 13 colonies on the North American continent, they looked to the past, back to another slave insurrection, that of 1760, which had been the most dangerous threat to the British Empire in America to date. They reflected on the difference between the unrest of 1760 and that of 1776, mostly in terms of the nature of warfare with their own slaves. In April 1760, an enslaved West African chief called Tacky staged a massive uprising against brutal conditions on the island of Jamaica and then the most profitable of Great Britain's 26 American colonies. Over the next 18 months, as their numbers grew into the thousands, the rebels thwarted an initial crackdown, conducting a skillful guerrilla campaign against the might of the British Empire. Plantations were destroyed, dozens of whites were killed. It was a war within a war. As Britain fought for imperial supremacy in Europe's first global conflict, the 7 Years' War, then raging across 5 continents, enslaved Black people fought to throw off the violent yoke of colonial rule. Shaken by the scale of the revolts, Britain's colonial forces eventually responded with overwhelming force, killing and brutally executing at least 500 black men and women. Hundreds more people were transported from the island for life. But the brutal response could not contain the revolt's consequences, which included an amplification of anti-black racism, the emergence of a movement to abolish the slave trade, and, perhaps surprisingly, a reorganization of the British Empire that provoked another, more successful rebellion on the North American continent. Now, George Bancroft, the statesman who founded the Academy, wrote the 10-volume history of the colonization of the United States that offered a sweeping account of this nation's founding, published in numerous editions from 1854 to 1878. But he was limited by his framing of early America as merely the prehistory of the US, and by the widely shared view that African history, and by extension the history of Africans and their descendants in the Americas, was of little consequence. Now, undoubtedly, the sources for investigating that history have always been spare. As Bancroft wrote of slave merchants, the traders and men have not been careful to record the lineage of their victims. And these lineages were complex and diverse. The slave trade covered a vast area of the African continent and involved a huge number of different peoples with different languages, religions, and ways of life. Because of these differences, Bancroft concluded that, and I'm quoting, "there was no unity among them and no immediate political danger from their joint action." Now, he did acknowledge that there had been slave revolts, but he accorded little significance to them, and I'm quoting again. "Sometimes the extreme harshness of the taskmasters may have provoked resistance, or sometimes an African, accustomed from birth to freedom, and reduced to slavery by the chances of war, carried with him across the Atlantic the indomitable spirit of a warrior. But the instances of insurrection were insulated and without result. Destitute of common traditions, customs, and laws, the black population existed in fragments, having no bonds of union but color and misfortune." Now, this assumption led Bancroft to ignore the insurrection in Jamaica, though his Chronicle of the 7 Years' War ran over several chapters. That assumption has also been widely shared. And this evening, I want to tell you that Bancroft was wrong and why it makes a difference, but also that Bancroft was partly right. African war captives, as he noted, sometimes did continue their fights on the far side of the Atlantic. However, these struggles were based on the making of new coalitions that were far less fragmentary and far more consequential than Bancroft knew. So first, let me talk about the limitations of seeing the colonial period merely as the prehistory of the United States, before discussing Tacky's revolt and what I think are its underappreciated reverberations. 1776 customarily marks a moment in the origin of the United States of America, of course, when the Declaration of Independence announced the separation of the 13 colonies from Great Britain. When referring to the origins of the nation, though, that date obscures the broader context of the times. It deflects attention from the fact that Britain held 26 colonies in America, not just the 13 that broke away, and that by far the most profitable, militarily significant, and politically connected of them were those colonies in the Caribbean. This chart compares private wealth in various regions of Great Britain's empire in 1774. It divides the territories into England and Wales, British America as a whole, and then the 13 North American colonies that became the US, those in the British Caribbean, and then it divides the 13 colonies into 3 regions: Southern, Mid-Atlantic, and New England. As you can see, colonists on the continent held nearly 70% of the wealth in British America, largely because the total population of property holders was much greater than in the Caribbean. But when you break North America down by region, you see that wealth increased as you moved south. That is, according to the degree the colonial economy depended on enslaved labor. And when you examine the average amount of property held per free white person, an astonishing disparity leaps out. In the British Caribbean, where some 90% of the population was made up of enslaved black people, free white people were stupendously rich, boasting more than 17 times the wealth of those in the 13 colonies. Indeed, the average private wealth of a free white colonist in Jamaica the single most lucrative American colony, was nearly 58 times that of a similar settler in New England. Military deployments were distributed to protect that wealth. The Royal Navy kept its three main stations at Port Royal, Jamaica, established in 1696, English Harbor, Antigua from 1731, and Halifax, Nova Scotia after 1749, 2 in the Caribbean and 1 in Canada. Often, there were nearly as many warships assigned to Jamaica as to the whole of the North American continent. Jamaica's planters and merchants wielded greater influence in the imperial metropolis than their North American peers, which goes some way to explaining why poor Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts couldn't get as much support as he wanted, as fast as he wanted, from British policymakers when rebels rose up in that marginal colony in the 1770s. Before that American Revolution, the British were well aware that the event we now know as Tacky's Revolt represented the peak of imperial crisis, and Slave Revolt was generally a source of overwhelming concern. One planter who had lived through the upheaval wrote that whether we consider the extent and secrecy of its plan, the multitude of the conspirators, and the difficulty of opposing its eruptions in such a variety of places at once, the revolt was more formidable than any hitherto known in the West Indies. According to two slaveholders who wrote histories of the Jamaican conflict, one of them being Edward Long, pictured here, the rebellion was organized and executed principally by Coromantes from the Gold Coast, a people called Coromantes, the West African region stretching between the Comoe and Volta rivers, who had an established reputation for military prowess. Their displacement, forced migration, and rebellion shows how the slave trade shaped what I call the diasporic warfare that convulsed the 18th century Atlantic world. Here you get a sense of it on this map here. The slave trade spread people from Atlantic Africa throughout the Americas. Some who had been leaders suddenly found themselves uprooted from sustaining landscapes, scattered by trade winds and currents, and replanted in unfamiliar territories where they labored to rebuild their social lives. Inevitably, some of them determined that only war could end their bondage. This process of a dispersal from a native land, transplantation, and adaptation to a new and strange one is familiar to students of cultural change who have examined transformations in African religion, expression, and identity by viewing African American and Atlantic history in a common frame. A similar approach shows how the turmoil of enslavement and the daily hostilities of life in plantation society generated a militant response that traveled, took root, and sprouted in rebellions that reverberated across the Americas and back to Europe. That is what happened when those so-called Coromantes broke out in a series of insurrections and revolts. Most dramatically in Cartagena, Suriname, St. John, New York, Antigua, and Jamaica, an archipelago of insurrections stretching throughout the North Atlantic Americas. The Jamaican insurrections of 1760 and 61, followed by further uprisings in 65 and 66, were among the largest and most consequential of these. From what observers could glean of the aims and tactics of the rebels, it was clear that many had been soldiers in Africa. Perhaps whole cadres of people arrived in the Americas with military training and discipline, at least some knowledge of defensive and evasive tactics learned in Africa. Indeed, as some scholars suggest, American slave revolts might be seen in key respects as extensions of African wars. Viewing slave revolt as a species of warfare is thus the first step to envisioning a map of Atlantic history that shows how political and military practices travel, take root, and grow in disparate environments. For even as the slave trade forced people to remake and renegotiate their affiliations, the massive dispersal of Africans across the Atlantic scattered the seeds of military conflict throughout the Americas. The story of the Coromantes shows how African warfare was reconstituted, not as a direct continuation of previous struggles, but as an outgrowth of immigrant experiences. British slaveholders valued Coromantes highly. Planters stereotyped them as best suited for agricultural labor, and they had reputations for military bearing and discipline. They were often employed in command and supervisory roles in plantation work gangs, and sometimes they played subservient roles in the armed forces, including the Royal Navy. But the British also said that Coromantese were particularly rebellious and prone to uprisings. They were dangerous people to keep in bondage, in part for the same reason slave traders found the Gold Coast to be an abundant source of potential workers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the region witnessed the transformation of major empires, Dinshira, Akwamu, Akyem, and Ashanti, among dozens of smaller polities, which vied with each other in the region. The battles that attended these contests produced great quantities of war captives for sale to the Europeans on the coast. They also produced a turbulent environment in which complex military campaigns involved both European and African rivalries, multiple alliances, negotiations, and treachery. In fact, people from the Gold Coast did not form anything like a single ethnic group in Africa. So who were the Coromantese then? According to the best research on the subject, they were members of a loosely structured organization of co-nationals who socialized with and aided one another, forming what contemporaries called a nation in the Americas. As a basis of social communion, in an environment where militarism was a common experience, national gatherings could provide a forum for people to plan, organize, and stage revolts. When they did so, they drew upon their previous military experience. However, as a category of belonging, Coromantese was cross-cut by many other axes of identification. Coromantese spoke more than one language and came from many different regions and kingdoms, from which they brought a variety of historical experiences. Just as importantly, once in Jamaica, they served different roles in the slave society. So no amount of cultural similarity could resolve all the difficult negotiations of multiple interests and experiences among them. Even with their compatriots, enslaved Africans made friends and foes through a politics of belonging that made the debate about what it meant to be Coromantese in Jamaica as urgent as the forging of the identity itself. In the face of continual assaults on their personal dignity, slaves distinguished themselves by their political commitments as much as by ascribed classifications. Among the Coromantese, different ideas about how to live in slave society, how to evade its worst abuses, and how to destroy it altogether shaped their rebellions even as they recalled their prior experiences in Africa. In the turbulent world of Atlantic warfare, nothing was more important than learning where and how to form loyal units, alliances, and coalitions in the face of superior power. The enslaved had won this wisdom through hard experience on the Gold Coast before coming to America, where they learned it anew and with different particulars in order to make war on their masters. The former slave and Royal Navy veteran, Olaudah Equiano, famously defined slavery itself as a perpetual state of war. This was not war in the conventional sense, between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery was by nature a forceful assault, to be met with the simmering violence ignited by resentment against the fraud, rapine, and cruelty of slaveholders. To the enslavers, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection?" And it was not a rhetorical question. Since the early years of Jamaica's slave society, slaveholders had often considered the enslaved as irreconcilable and yet intestine enemies, made subject to the colonists only by the rule of the whip. Equiano had been in Jamaica in 1772 when the island was still reeling from the uprisings of the previous decade. There he had seen how an entire world could be organized around violence and counterattack. He held this view in common with Black people in other times and places, where the enslaved often characterized their bondage as a permanent state of low-intensity war, talking regularly about how they might wage that war. And this description might be more familiar now than it would have been a generation ago. Military theorists have become increasingly interested in warfare between great powers and improvised militias. Conflict dispersed over wide areas, with largely undefined battle lines and blurred distinctions between civilians and combatants. These current trends in the study of warfare recommend a re-examination of the martial geography of Atlantic slavery too. Warfare migrates. This was never more apparent than in the era when the violence of imperial expansion and enslavement transformed Europe, Africa, and the Americas as they interacted across the Atlantic Ocean. European imperial conflicts extended the dominion of capitalist agriculture. African battles fed captives to transatlantic trade in slaves. Masters and their human property struggled with one another continuously. These clashes amounted to a borderless slave war, war to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, precipitating wars waged by the enslaved against slaveholders. In this sense, Tacky's revolt was but a war within other wars, which had diverging and overlapping provocations, combat zones, political alliances, and enemy combatants. In effect, it combined 4 conflicts at once. It was an extension of wars on the African continent. It was a race war between black slaves and white slaveholders. It was a struggle among black people over the terms of their communal belonging, for effective control of local territory, and the establishment of their own political legacies. And it was, most immediately, one of the hardest fought battles of the 7 Years' War, the titanic global conflict between Great Britain and its European rivals. Each of these 4 struggles emerged from different currents that converged and eddied in the Jamaican insurrections of the 1760s. Charting their course suggests new stories of place, territory, and movement, a new cartography of slave revolt that braids together the histories of Europe, Africa, and America. Just as one example, let's take one of the revolt's principal leaders, a man called Wager, also known by his African name, Opongo. Opongo fought in each kind of these campaigns. He was an elite official on the Gold Coast, trading with British forts and probably engaging in combat with political rivals. Captured and enslaved by a Royal Navy ship captain, he fought in naval battles against the French, alongside other Africans from the Gold Coast. He was one among dozens of other black mariners employed at Jamaica, who constituted about a quarter of all the crews plying the island's shipping lanes at the time. After Wager's discharge from the warship, he was a driver on that captain's sugar plantation, helping to keep other workers in subjection for a time, before he came to lead an uprising that the British could fairly call a race war. As he engaged in these successive struggles, he connected the small scale of everyday violence and enslavement and coerced labor to the grand scale of imperial politics. The hemispheric reach of these conflicts mapped interlocking patterns of state, commerce, migration, labor, and militancy. Across vast distances, these wars within wars connected the constituent elements of empire, diaspora, and insurrection. Such an integrated history of slave revolt takes us far from the plantations, beyond relations between masters and slaves, and outside the conventional locations for observing racial violence. Vectors of slave war in Jamaica formed a knot in the intertwined itineraries of soldiers who fought in Europe, North America, and Africa, sailors who crisscrossed the Atlantic world for merchants and empires, and slaves who were swept up in many conflicts on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I'm going to let you all read my account of the revolt for yourselves. Hopefully, you'll get a hold of the book if I've encouraged you to do so. You can get a glimpse of the way it unfolded on these maps here, and I know this is recorded, so if you want to get closer to them, you can come back to the recording. But for now, let me just sketch out some of what I think are the underappreciated reverberations of Tacky's revolt to give you a sense of why the insurrection was not without result, as Bancroft put it, and how I hope the book can model the kinds of connections that braid events in distant locales across long spans of time. Tacky's revolt anticipated the American Revolution by a decade and a half, and the Haitian Revolution by 3 decades. It can be considered one of the first great events of what historians call the Age of Revolution. And yet, it is hardly known outside Jamaica to people who aren't historians of the British Empire or Atlantic slavery. This is despite the fact that it influenced 2 of the signal moments of the era: the reorganization of British imperial governance that so irritated colonists in North America, and the early beginning of the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. Let me take each of those in turn. In the aftermath of the revolt, to recoup some of the public costs, Jamaica's House of Assembly passed new poll taxes and commercial duties. The colonial government also committed to a tax on vellum, parchment, and paper ascertained by stamps, something that imperial reformers would attempt a few years later for all of America. The Jamaica Stamp Act of 1760 was meant explicitly to address the costs of the revolt. The duty continued in force until December 1763, when it was repealed as too great a burden for all but the wealthiest colonists. As a model for the more contentious 1765 Stamp Act that would rile the colonists in North America, the 1760 tax was an early local instance of a far larger reform effort stimulated by the 7 Years' War. As imperial policymakers celebrated military victories in North America, Africa, and the Caribbean, they contemplated the threat to their most vital colony. On November 7th, 1760, 2 weeks after the death of King George II, the Board of Trade considered official accounts of the Jamaican insurrection, which raised the urgent question of how an expanding empire might contain its internal antagonists. In this liminal moment for imperial management, a new policy would take shape. The British statesmen had worried over the governance of America for more than a decade, since the conclusion of the previous war with France and Spain in 1748. The colony's demographic, economic, and strategic value had increased dramatically in the first half of the 18th century, and the complexity of administering them had grown in tandem. British members of Parliament were spurred into a reform effort partly by the behavior of North American colonists during the 7 Years' War. In the midst of the conflict, colonial assemblies flouted the authority of governors, elected officials, allowed flagrant violations of the Navigation Acts against trading with the enemy, and colonists often failed to supply enough local troops and resources to the war effort. As the historian Jack P. Green has explained, this coincided with a dramatic shift from an essentially permissive to a fundamentally restrictive philosophy of colonial administration in London, amplifying the widespread conviction that the colonies had too many privileges and that those privileges ought to be curtailed. News of the slave war in Jamaica, the most profitable colony, strengthened the policymakers' resolve. And in this, they were helped by a shift in attitude among Jamaican colonists. These had previously been as restive and independent as their North American counterparts. But the slave insurrection reminded slaveholders of the benefits of empire. They soon conveyed their gratitude, along with a request for more troops, to the new King George III and the Lords of Trade. The Colonial Assembly thanked the king. If not for His Majesty's forces, they wrote, the lives and properties of your loyal subjects would, in all likelihood, have become prey to their slaves. Like North American colonists, slaveholders in Jamaica resented the influence of metropolitan intervention, as well as the imposition of new taxes. However, unlike so many in North America, their recent experience with slave revolt encouraged them to remain duly subject to imperial command, even passing that Stamp Act to help finance their own security. They did not like many imperial reforms, but they acquiesced to them. After the 7 Years' War, with Jamaica having served as a model for the assertion of imperial control, policymakers preferred a raft of new legislation for the North American colonies. Yet, unlike colonial Jamaica's submission, these policies inspired the well-known backlash that would ultimately split the British Empire in 1776. If the Jamaican insurrections helped to shape imperial policy toward the colonies, they also offered a rationale for the reform of colonial slavery. Fearing further rebellion, concerned Britons put forth pragmatic plans for enhancing the security of the colonies by limiting their dependence on the slave trade and ameliorating the condition of the enslaved. Ironically, perhaps perversely, the work of the historian planter Edward Long had a significant impact on a budding anti-slavery discourse. Long argued that slave revolt was a criminal trait of the Coromantee people, and his fearful hatred of Coromantees fed his loathing for Africans in general. Indeed, Through a chain of association linking various unwelcome traits, Blackness in general came to signify the general potential for danger that Long attributed most specifically to Coromantese. In the end, regardless of their differences, Long surmised that Black people must actually constitute a different species of humankind. For this view, Long has been called an early proponent of scientific racism, which gained currency in the 18th century as writers sought to classify and rank the world's peoples. More immediately, though, Long's racism was as much a specific reaction to Black political agency as it was a general theory of human difference. His views projected his experience of the fragility of white mastery in the West Indies, where slaveholders had recently been frustrated, at times even humiliated, in their attempts to pacify the enslaved. Though he thought that slavery was unavoidably necessary, in his words, for the increase of English commerce, he viewed the African presence as an unqualified evil. One of the more enduring myths in the corpus of racial fantasy is that white people are underdogs, besieged by hypermasculine and ultraviolent Blacks. Slave Revolt engendered this trope. In his reaction to Jamaica's slave war in the 1760s, Long became one of the most erudite and prominent purveyors of racial panic, nurturing a violent strain of nationalist discourse that would infect the political imagination of many white people down to the present day. In arguing the principal threat to colonial slavery were African and especially Coromantee insurgents, Long promoted the idea that a native-born slave population would be more tractable. Long thought that if planters could avoid working their slaves to death, as they often did, attach them to estates rather than continuing to scatter them by sale, as they also did, establish better conditions for child rearing and encourage the progress of Christianity, then slaveholders might be more secure in their possessions. They could also save money on the ever-rising prices of imported laborers from Africa. Raising up native-born populations would facilitate what reformers constantly referred to as the improvement of the plantations, and would lead, they thought, to a kinder and gentler and less menacing slavery. Through the beginning of the 19th century, people who campaigned against the slave trade would invoke Long's text to argue that ending the traffic would enhance the internal security of the British Empire. So in this way, Jamaica's turbulence indirectly helped to nurture the emerging anti-slave trade movement. And fear of Africans had indeed inspired the first efforts to restrict the transatlantic slave trade. For example, responding to a 1712 African uprising in nearby New York, the Pennsylvania Assembly imposed a prohibitive 20-pound duty on slave importations, citing what they called diverse plots and insurrections, not only in the islands, but also on the mainland of America, as the reason for their action. After a revolt near South Carolina's Stono River in 1739, that colony enacted a 10-year moratorium on the importation of Africans, but planters soon found they could not do without them. Amid news of Jamaica's troubles in the 1760s, other colonies tried again. Virginia's legislators attempted to levy increased duties on imported slaves in 1767, 1769, and 1772. As Virginia's governor explained to British officials, colonists had, quote, just cause to apprehend the most dangerous consequence of importing Africans and should find means not only of preventing their increase, but also of lessening their number. He believed, quoting again, the interest of the country would manifestly require the total expulsion of them. Influenced more by merchant interest than by colonial concerns, London disallowed all three of these Virginia Duty Acts. Restrictions on the slave trade were more successful, however, in Pennsylvania. In 1761, with news of Jamaica's slave war appearing regularly in the Pennsylvania Gazette, the colony passed a law to increase the import duties on slaves and extend its enforcement in perpetuity. In 1773, Pennsylvania doubled that impost. And finally, in 1780, the colony passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery itself. Now, as much as these laws might have expressed increasing opposition to the practice of slaveholding, and they did, there were also security measures aimed at discouraging the arrival of potentially insurgent Africans. If most white colonists feared the presence of Africans, many others empathized with their plight. In the abolition's early beginnings, African rebels often drew sympathetic responses, especially from people in places that held fewer numbers of slaves in the Caribbean. Many British and North American readers were more horrified by the brutality of their British co-nationals than by the violence of the rebels. Accounts of the execution circulated more widely, with the growing popularity of sentimental literature and Christian martyrology, which helped the British to imagine their nation as a moral community founded in persecution, death, and religious virtue. For some, this imagined community extended to include the enslaved, however tenuously, and African rebels came to be seen as victims sacrificed to the cruel tyranny of slaveholders. One pamphlet, circulated during the 1760 revolt, J. Fillmore's Two Dialogues on the Man Trade, argued that given the terrors of enslavement, nature's higher law authorized violence against enslavers, and I'm quoting at length. All the black men now on our plantations who are by unjust force deprived of their liberty and held in slavery, as they have none upon earth to appeal to, may lawfully repel that force with force, and to recover their liberty, destroy their oppressors. And not only so, but it is the duty of others, white as well as black, to assist those miserable creatures, if they can, in their attempts to deliver themselves out of slavery and to rescue them out of the hands of their cruel tyrants. Now, few others are willing to go this far, at least in print, but the pamphlet influenced Anthony Benezet, the Pennsylvania Quaker who laid the intellectual foundations for slave trade abolition throughout the British Empire. Although he avoided the topic of slave revolt specifically, he frequently invoked higher law doctrine against the trade in human beings. Among his fellow Quakers, a fervent opposition to war induced them to see the violence stimulated by slave trading as an unconscionable evil, and their belief that the slave trade was a constant source of war was an orthodox line of reasoning through the early 19th century. Even some who could not condone slave revolt could condemn slaveholder tyranny. In 1764, a Boston writer asserted that West Indian planters were used to an arbitrary and cruel government over their slaves, having for so long tasted the sweets of oppressing their fellow creatures. That sentiment reverberated strongly in James Otis's Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, published the same year. His defense of the rights of American settlers from the intimidation of imperial administration declared that colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or black. In England, people mocked American colonists' pretensions to being oppressed by invoking their brutality toward the enslaved. In the early years of the American Revolution, the literary celebrity Samuel Johnson famously raised a toast to the next slave rebellion in the West Indies at an Oxford dinner party. By the end of the century, then, stories of revolts against slaveholders and the gruesome executions of slave rebels had helped to promote an emerging anti-slavery consciousness, which ultimately enabled the campaigns that turned the British public against the slave trade and slavery in the 19th century. But all this happened too late for the rebels themselves. Like most slave insurrections, Tacky's war ended badly. The insurgents were killed or captured, publicly executed in grisly displays, or banished from the island, probably along with many bystanders who had taken no part in the fighting. Looking back with a historian's perspective, one can see that the outcome was never really in doubt. The balance of forces doomed the rebellion from the start. The Coromantese would not win the colony from the British, as the North Americans would do 2.5 decades later, and as the Haitians would do by 1804, taking Saint-Domingue from the French. But the rebels in Jamaica did not know they would fail. They acted with the hope of success. Even amid the business of war and enslavement, in a colony garrisoned for battle with foreign and domestic enemies, they could find fissures in the landscape of planter power beyond the reach of slaveholders' whips. They even could challenge the combined forces of the British Empire and find an enduring place in popular memory. Tacky's revolt and its reverberations through the 1760s represented a watershed in the course of Atlantic history. If regional political maps had been drawn by the wars that opened new territories for cultivation, stimulated the slave trade, and enhanced state power, the slave rebellions etched another record of historical movement. They channeled people into new solidarities and gave meaning to categories of belonging, partitioned friends from foes and bystanders, and redirected the priorities of governing authorities. Since Jamaica was the commercial and military hub of the British American Empire, its most profitable settlement, and most powerful overseas military stronghold, what happened there was bound to reverberate widely. Yet the legacy of the 1760s is ambiguous. At the close of the 7 Years' War, Britain kept its prize colony, though Tacky's revolt helped to stimulate that imperial reform effort that provoked the greater challenge on the North American continent. If the Jamaican slave revolts in some ways anticipated the Haitian Revolution, offering a beacon of hope to the enslaved, they also left Black people divided. The Coromantese augmented their reputation as formidable fighters, helping to cast doubts on the wisdom of continuing the transatlantic slave trade, while at the same time strengthening the association between Blackness and social danger. Even in the United States, as late as the mid-19th century, anxious slaveholders would refer to potential troublemakers as Tackies among us. Perhaps the ambiguous nature of these legacies helps to explain why they register so faintly in the imagination today. The Coromantee wars that shaped the era don't fit neatly into the prevailing narrative of the rise and progress of liberal freedom, even though such small, dirty wars epitomize the relationship between labor, commerce, and global power. They are obscured by the more obvious consequences of the American and Haitian revolutions, which seem to speak more directly to the Western history of liberty. The relative obscurity of these events is also due to the reluctance to acknowledge slave revolt as an act of war. Few things terrify the wealthy and powerful more than the prospect of losses to the poor and weak, which would signify a world turned upside down. Dominant peoples and nation states develop elaborate conventions for legitimating conflict, maintaining their honor in victory and defeat, and recognizing violence as a regular, if unfortunate, feature of political struggle. But between the powerful and those they dominate by daily habit, there is no limit to the lengths they may go to maintain their supremacy. They will commit atrocities and massacres, to be sure, but they will disavow them too. They will refuse to admit that their combatants are legitimate enemies, and they will denigrate the past and present struggles of less powerful peoples. Because slaveholders wrote the first draft of this history, subsequent historiography has strained to escape their point of view. What George Bancroft did not fully recognize, and what I hope I've conveyed tonight, is how events in far-flung and seemingly disconnected places had consequences in other, ostensibly isolated locales. How the process of forced migration from Africa in a world of imperial warfare shaped the history of America in surprising ways. The slave insurrections of the 1760s in Jamaica can justly be narrated as stories of heroism and defeat. But in their courage and ingenuity, these insurgents also charted the landscape of force and its limitations that the maps of the powerful never meant to show. These counter mappings reveal a geography of hope and possibility in the making. Fugitive territories, carved out through political struggle, they were difficult to maintain, paradoxical in their alliances, and in most cases, yet to be won. Thank you. And I believe we have some time for questions, and
Yes.
you can email your questions directly to Professor Sagstetter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for that talk. I really appreciate it. I do have a few questions. The first question is from a midshipman, and it's just a clarification question on the graph that you showed towards the beginning of the talk. What is the difference between British America, the 13 colonies, and New England?
Oh, okay. So on the eve of the American Revolution, Great Britain held 26 colonies in America, right? Kind of from Canada all the way down to the Caribbean. Okay. In that chart, what it wants to do is it wants to break out British America as a whole. So if we think of the entire empire, it wants to break out British North America, right? So you just see the 13 colonies. And then it wants to break out the regions of the 13 colonies, right? New England, the Mid-Atlantic, what we think of as the South, and then the West Indies. So that you can see, as I said, British America as a whole was economically doing pretty well, right? If you look at private physical wealth as compared to England and Wales, right? But when you break it down by region, you can see the least profitable region of North America is New England, right? With Massachusetts being, I don't want to say poorest, but let's say the least profitable colony in the British Empire. The West Indies, far, far more profitable than any place in North America, right? With Jamaica being the most profitable colony in the West Indies. Now, the other thing you see breaking it down by region is that as you move south, that is, as you move into territories with larger and larger populations of enslaved people, there's more private physical wealth per free white person, right? So what one can see, just to put it as plainly as possible, is that the source of wealth and the source of greatest wealth in the British Empire in the 18th century was slave labor, right? And that's what I think that chart shows really well. So that you see in Massachusetts, which was a colony that was the least dependent directly on slave labor, although they were trading with the West Indies, you find that colonists in Jamaica are 58 times as wealthy as colonists in Massachusetts.
Okay, thank you. The next question's from Midshipman Max Oberman. He says, when discussing the wealth disparity of the British West Indies and the American colonies, does this consider slaves as currency? I know that during this time, many Southern Americans determined or partially determined their wealth through how many slaves they owned rather than actual currency. Does the statistic for the wealth gap take into account slaves as a value or an asset in the net worth, or does this statistic refer solely to the currency? I believe the slide showed sterling pounds.
So we're talking sterling. The value is in sterling, so you get a sense of the value. But we're not just talking about currency. We're talking about the wealth held. So all property held and claimed, right? And as you say, yes, enslaved property was capital, right? It was both capital and labor. That's the trick, right? You owned the labor for the production of other goods that you were going to sell for more currency. So enslaved laborers, to the extent they're owned, right, are definitely held as capital property, and that factors into the wealth statistics, right? So you see, and you know, they're also like used as bond for debts, as for securities. So they're kind of considered, enslaved people are considered capital and wealth by all banks, all insurance companies, and all people trading.
Okay. The next question is from Midshipman Sidney Willis, Midshipman Second Class. Says, do you believe the slave war was perpetuated after slavery had officially ended in the Americas? If so, in what ways can the effects be seen in contemporary America?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, if we take Olaudah Equiano seriously and all those other people who argued that slavery itself was a state of low-intensity warfare, and we look at, you know, I like to go back to a text that some people know called Slavery and Social Death by Orlando Patterson, which was a broad study of slavery in 66 different societies around the world from ancient to modern, right? And what he discerned there, he's a sociologist, so he wanted to have a handy definition of slavery. And what he said was that slavery was the permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons, right? So a lot of people have focused on natal alienation, and what that meant, quite simply, is that enslaved people did not have rights over their relationships to their own ancestors or their progeny, right? Their lineages were interrupted by the fact that they were held as slaves by someone else. General dishonor is that enslaved peoples anywhere in the world of whatever color were held to be at the kind of bottom of society, of the lowest social status in society. What's important here, though, is that permanent violent domination. Everywhere, Patterson found, slavery was maintained only by collective violence and was often met by collective violence in response. Now, to come directly to your question, the question is whether or not collective violence against those generally dishonored persons, right, or people who are recognized to be dishonored within society, recognized to have low social status by whatever markers, right, whether that collective violence ends with emancipation. And I would argue there's a kind of anti-Black militarism that attends to American slavery that does not end when emancipation ends, right? When emancipation begins. That what you see is a logic that people who are marked as generally dishonored And in the case of American slavery, and when I say American, I mean Pan-American. I mean, North America all the way down to South America to Brazil. Those people are still marked out for special discrimination and are often the targets of violence, right? In a way that others who are not marked out as dishonored in the society are not. So the logic of anti-Black militarism, I think, is something that is a continuity, is a legacy of slavery that we still have to contend with. Now, when I say anti-Black militarism, I'm talking about a more systemic thing than, say, personal animus against Black people. This isn't about, we normally think of racism as a kind of personal thing, where it's like somebody doesn't like another kind of person. What I'm talking about is a value that can be held across society. So for example, right, we see in all the former slave societies of the Americas, right, they tend to be more violent than other societies that didn't have slavery. So for example, we just compare Massachusetts with South Carolina and Louisiana, right? Higher murder rates in South Carolina and Louisiana, more police violence against disproportionately Black people in South Carolina and Louisiana than in a place like Massachusetts. Doesn't mean there's none in Massachusetts, but one can see the pattern. Now, let's continue on. In Jamaica, right, we have an extremely high murder rate. And we have extremely high rates of police abuse against Black people, even though the cops are all Black, right? In Brazil, extremely high rates of violence, disproportionately directed against Black people, those people who bear, right, the phenotypical marks of descent from low social status, right? Even though a higher proportion of their cops are Black than maybe of our cops in the United States. So what we're talking about is a legacy of slavery that's Pan-American. It's not specifically or uniquely a US problem, which makes it both harder to get to tackle, to get around, but also in some ways kind of more obvious, right? To understand this history as a history that we share in common across the hemisphere. Another reason that I like to think of US history as emerging out of a broader Atlantic history, as opposed to thinking of it as being something utterly distinctive, which is why in the talk I gave to you today, I tried to talk about how the American Revolution itself, right, must be seen within this broader Atlantic circuit of interrelations, political struggles, and decisions that it emerged from.
Okay. The next question is from Midshipman Irene Tyler. She asks, do you see any ways in which Tacky's rebellion could have succeeded? And if so, what impacts do you think a successful revolt would have had on the anti-slave movement?
Yeah, it's a great question. We can kind of project ahead to the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, right? So at the same time as the French Revolution, roughly beginning in 1789, there's a kind of crack up in among the colonists, the French colonists in Saint-Domingue, which was, right, a colony with about 500,000 enslaved people there. And that was France's most profitable colony in the world and the most profitable European colony in the world, right, in the 1790s, okay? So when the ruling class of Saint-Domingue splits because of the French Revolution, there's an opportunity there for the enslaved population. And in 1791, there's a massive uprising, right? And then there's a long 13-year war, which involves a British occupation that's defeated by the slave uprising, which involves the Spanish trying to take that half of the island, which is defeated by the slave uprising, which involves Napoleon sending his brother-in-law to try and reconquer Saint-Domingue in 1802, and his brother-in-law's campaign fails. And finally, Haiti emerges as the second independent post-colonial nation state in the Americas after the United States in 1804, right? So one can see, right, how that worked. Now, your question is, what impact did that have on the anti-slavery movement? Well, it was ambivalent, right? So some anti-slavery campaigners see Haiti as an example of what happens if you try to maintain slavery, right? It's untenable. It's a security threat. And we should, cut off the slave trade for that reason, right? And some say, oh yeah, but look what happens with these massacres, with this war, if you don't kind of maintain colonial supremacy with as tight a hand as possible. And that argues against this anti-slavery campaigners. So again, kind of all of these events tend to cut both ways. So I can go back to your question about whether or not Tacky's revolt could have been successful. I think it very well might have been successful, and the rebels might have taken the entire island had the British split in the way the French did 30 years later. They didn't, right? And because that was the most powerful naval station in the British Empire, they had a lot of naval forces they could throw at putting that rebellion down, and there was no conflict among the British that created another opportunity.
Okay, I've got about 12 more questions in the queue, but I believe we're about out of time. So
I think we could take a few more.
Is that okay?
It depends on your audience.
Professor McCarthy, is that?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, here's an intriguing one, I think, that's particularly provocative. And this is from Midshipman Faith Bania. She asks, does Dr. Brown have any advice for us with the issues prevalent in our society that is still healing from the aftermath of slavery? How do we continue to help bridge the gaps that still existed and exist today, especially here at the Academy? And to answer her question, yes, this lecture was recorded and you will be able to watch it again because she says that she would like to do so. So not exactly sure how it's going to be disseminated, but I will be sure to get that information out to everybody as soon as I know.
Yeah, great. I love the question. So my answer, and this is the answer I'm naturally inclined toward as a teacher, is the first thing we have to do is face up to this history and learn it honestly together, right? This is a history that, as I teach it, is everyone's history, right? The history of Jamaica happens to be the history of North America as well, in the way I teach it. The history of West Africa, which is the history of the Caribbean, also shapes the history of North America and shapes the history of Europe. So kind of in my way of approaching this history through these connections, I think of this as all of our history. That Black history is just history, right? I don't distinguish really these various types of history as being separable, right? When I'm emphasizing Black history, I'm always looking at its interconnection with other kinds of history. So that's the first thing to recognize. The second thing to recognize is that, yes, these legacies are still with us, right? And until we kind of acknowledge that, we are never going to overcome them. They're always going to fester, right? So an honest, good faith engagement with history, I think, is just the kind of first priority, because we can't wish it away, because the legacies don't go away on their own, right? And simply saying like, this history is here, deal with it, doesn't solve the problem either. It's just a first step. Once we acknowledge that this is the history we emerge from, then we decide what kind of society we want to be, right? Granted that we have this, quite awful, difficult history, what do we do with it, right? Our principles of equality, democracy, fairness, important to us as a society. Are those the principles that we want to espouse? Well, then we apply them, right? Understanding that we emerge from a certain kind of history. Rather than kind of wielding this history against each other, we use it in common to think about where we want to go, right? I guess that's my simplest answer.
Maybe one more.
Sure.
There's still quite a queue, but this one was interesting, I thought. This is from Midshipman Francisco Villamil Rodriguez. Asks, what are the implications of the Jamaican and Haitian revolutions being seen as slave uprisings instead of legitimate wars? Did recognizing these conflicts as revolts delegitimize these struggles?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because at the time, right, what that means is that, people pursuing wars against people deemed to be illegitimate combatants, right, don't feel like they have to follow their own conventions or established laws of war. Meaning, right, they can do anything, right? It's kind of, so, if you look at the book, you'll see, there are parts of it that are pretty gruesome and in fact were pretty hard to write, because the kinds of rules and conventions governing combat between legitimate enemies, legitimate combatants, are not respected when it comes to combat with slaves. And so refusing to recognize these enslaved peoples as legitimate enemies enables and allows the British military to do whatever they want, right? So there is a concrete consequence there at the time. But in retrospect, it also matters, right? Tacky's revolt was a major part of the 7 Years' War. Many of the soldiers, sailors, and Marines who fought in other more famous battles of the 7 Years' War in Quebec, in Senegal, in Martinique, and Guadeloupe came to Jamaica to suppress this revolt right afterwards, right? And yet, in the major histories of the 7 Years' War, Tacky's revolt is not mentioned, right? There's the most kind of comprehensive 600, 700-page book on the 7 Years' War doesn't mention Tacky's revolt at all, right? And I think this is because it's seen as a slave revolt and therefore something distinct. As I said, this despite the fact that the people who are fighting it are people who are fighting other battles of the 7 Years' War as well. It's just seen to be categorically different and therefore not a subject that had to be contended with. What I'm trying to argue in this book is it's very much part of the 7 Years' War, and it's connected with all these other currents of warfare and politics in the 18th century that we have ignored because we haven't seen it as a legitimate war.
Great. So I think we're out of time. Is it fair to say, would you be willing to entertain further questions if people had them, if they were to email you?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Great. So hopefully
I'm easy to find. There are two Vincent Browns you'll find if you Google. One of them is an NFL wide receiver. That's not me. I'm the one who's built like an intellectual. So you'll know the difference.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so very much for speaking to us tonight. That was a very interesting talk, and I just the list of questions in my queue attests to the fact that this was very engaging talk for the midshipmen and the audience, and so we appreciate very much your joining us tonight.
Well, I'm really grateful for the invitation, and to both of you and to all of you guys for having listened to me. And good luck with the vaccination campaign as it goes on. And I appreciate your service.
Let me just add my own thank you, Dr. Brown, for a wonderful talk and a wonderful evening with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Okay.